Hi viewers, welcome back to Silent Case, the channel where buried truths, unsolved mysteries, and the echoes of the past come alive. Every story has a shadow, every secret a voice, and every silence a story waiting to be told. Today, we unravel the hidden layers of a case that time tried to forget. Today's story takes us to 1942 Texas, where a father and son vanished without a trace, and decades later, a hidden chapel crypt reveals the chilling secrets that the sheriff wanted to bury forever. Prepare yourselves, because the truth has a way of clawing its way back. On a quiet night in 1942, Robert Hayes and his young son Samuel disappeared from the dusty highways of Texas. No one saw them again, until the secrets beneath Crooked Hill began to surface. Subscribe and watch the full story now. On a swollen night in the summer of 1942, the kind of night when the Texas sky looked bruised and swollen with unspoken anger, Clark Hensley and his 10-year-old son Evan left the small wooded church on the edge of Crooked Hill Road. The rain had already begun to fall in heavy, uneven sheets, rattling the church roof like restless fingers tapping for entry. The congregation scattered, families rushing to cars, hats and coats pulled tight, voices swallowed by the wind. Clark placed his hand gently on Evan's shoulder as they walked toward the old green truck. Witnesses would later describe the moment in almost the same words. The father calm and steady, the boy tired but cheerful, holding a folded paper star he'd made during Sunday school. Nothing seemed unusual, not yet. No one knew they would be the last to see the pair alive. When the truck pulled away, its dim headlights cut briefly through the fog that hovered above the dirt road like a low, hanging ghost. A few seconds later, the taillights dissolved into darkness, disappearing behind the curve near the abandoned chapel that, bend, silent and ordinary for decades, would soon become the center of a mystery that lasted a generation. At the Hensley home, Margaret, Clark's wife, listened anxiously as the storm thickened. Clark should have returned within 15 minutes. The church wasn't far, barely a mile and a half. She paced the living room, glancing repeatedly at the grandfather clock. When 40 minutes passed, her chest tightened with unease. She stepped outside, calling her husband's name into the wind, but only rain answered her, soaking her hair and filling the yard with the smell of wet earth. By midnight, when Clark and Evan still had not returned, Margaret made the decision that would forever haunt her memory. She walked to the sheriff's office through pounding rain, clutching a lantern that flickered with each gust of wind. Sheriff Dwayne Mercer, a stern, broad-shouldered man whose reputation carried more fear than trust, listened to her trembling voice without a single expression shifting across his face. He promised to send someone out at first light, dismissing the severity of the situation. Margaret begged him to start searching immediately, but Mercer simply repeated, "Storm's too strong. Roads aren't safe." Later, residents would whisper that Mercer never even stood from his chair. The next morning, volunteers gathered before sunrise, forming search groups with dogs, lanterns, and muddy boots. They combed the winding roads, ravines, and thick mesquite brush. The riverbanks were checked twice. Farmers left their morning chores to help, walking shoulder to shoulder in long lines across the fields. Everyone expected to find something: a broken branch, tire tracks, a sign of a crash. But the land revealed nothing. No twisted metal, no skid marks, no footprints, no cries for help drifting through the trees. The search continued for 2 days. Anxiety shifted into dread. Dread settled into a sinking ache no one dared to articulate. Some whispered that the storm had swallowed the Hensleys whole. Others whispered darker theories, that someone had been waiting on that road, hidden by the storm's chaos. On the third day, a clue finally emerged. 2 brothers searching near the chapel found faint tire marks curving sharply toward a ditch. The direction was wrong. Clark never used that path. One of the brothers ran to alert the sheriff, but when Sheriff Mercer arrived, he sent the men away, claiming the marks were old and irrelevant. That afternoon, the tracks were covered with shovels of dirt. Witnesses watched, confused and uneasy, but said nothing. It was the first moment the community felt something was deeply off. Margaret, sleepless and hollow, stood on her porch each evening, lantern burning beside her like a stubborn echo of hope. Neighbors brought food, comfort, and prayers, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark road, waiting for headlights that never returned. She kept Evan's paper star beside her bed. She pressed Clark's jacket to her face. At night, she refused to believe they were gone, but by the end of the week, even hope grew quiet. Sheriff Mercer announced his conclusion. The storm took them. The river carried them downstream. Nothing more to find. He closed the case quickly and decisively, ignoring every unsettled feeling rippling through the town. Only one thing was certain: the Chapel Road, sealed off by Mercer that same night, held an answer no one was allowed to see, and years later, someone would finally open that locked door. Morning light crept slowly across Crooked Hill Road, revealing the scars the storm had carved into the land. Fallen branches, deep ruts carved by water, and a thin mist clinging stubbornly to the ground all made the scene feel unreal, like a place caught between night and day, truth and silence. Search volunteers gathered again, determined to find what the sheriff insisted was already lost. Their boots squelched through mud as they fanned out across the drenched highway, calling Clark and Evans' names into the pale air. The storm had passed, but its weight still lingered. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of dread that refused to loosen its grip. Margaret stood near the roadside, arms wrapped around herself as if holding her own heart together. She watched the men move through the brush with long poles, checking ditches and culverts. Every rustle in the grass made her flinch. Every distant shout made her hope, then fear, then hope again, but hour after hour nothing surfaced. The highway remained empty, indifferent, as if it swallowed secrets instead of dust. Around mid-morning, Deputy Harris, one of the youngest on the force, knelt to examine something near the shoulder of the road. His gloved fingers brushed across faint indentations in the mud. 2 curved tire tracks leading toward the ditch near the chapel path. They were subtle but distinct, shaped differently than Clark's truck tires. Harris swallowed hard and motioned to the others. When the volunteers crowded around, murmurs rippled through them. The tracks suggested a vehicle had swerved sharply, maybe at high speed, maybe in pursuit, maybe blocking the road. Whatever the reason, it wasn't consistent with the sheriff's storm accident explanation. A man asked in a hushed tone, "You think they were forced off the road?" Another whispered back, "Or chased." The theory spread through the group like static electricity, quiet, sharp, unavoidable. When Sheriff Mercer arrived, his expression darkened instantly. He examined the tracks for a few seconds before straightening, jaw tight. "These marks are old," he said, "weather, worn, not connected." Harris blinked, taken aback. "But sir, these wouldn't be older than last night's storm." Mercer cut him off. "They're irrelevant. Cover them. We stick to the river search." His tone left no space for question or reason. The volunteers exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed. Harris hesitated, forcing a reluctant shovel into the mud. The marks disappeared under fresh dirt, erased from sight but not from memory. Margaret watched from a distance, feeling something inside her fracture. She didn't understand investigative procedures, but she understood desperation, and she understood dismissal. The sheriff's behavior didn't feel like certainty. It felt like avoidance. By noon, the highway search shifted west toward the ravine. Dogs sniffed through thick undergrowth, handlers shouting commands as they moved in coordinated sweeps, but the forest remained mute. No scent trails, no personal belongings, no broken vehicle parts. As the sun rose higher, the land appeared untouched, as if the storm had washed away not just clues but the entire truth. A farmer named Reuben Lane approached Mercer quietly. "Sheriff," he murmured, "my wife says she heard a scream last night, near the bend." Mercer didn't hesitate. "Storm noise, nothing more, but she swears. Let it go, Reuben." The dismissal was sharp enough to silence the man instantly. Throughout the afternoon, volunteers continued across miles of rough terrain. But by dusk, exhaustion began to settle in. Shoulders slumped, voices thinned. Lanterns were lit once more as the second night approached. Margaret remained on the roadside, refusing to return home. She watched the lantern lights move like fragile fireflies across the fields, each flicker a small hope. Near sunset, another subtle clue appeared, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a mesquite branch. It looked like the color of Evan's Sunday shirt, pale blue. Harris examined it with trembling fingers, his stomach tightening. But once again Mercer arrived swiftly, snatched the fabric from his hand, and pocketed it without a word. The volunteers exchanged looks that held more fear than suspicion. Something was happening, something Mercer didn't want seen. By the time the search ended for the night, the highway felt hollow, stripped of answers. Margaret finally allowed a neighbor to walk her home, though her eyes stayed fixed on the darkness behind her. Just before the last lantern was extinguished, Deputy Harris approached the bend one final time. He stared at the freshly covered tire marks, his breath hitching. Something about the sheriff's urgency unsettled him deeply. He whispered to himself, "These weren't Clark's tires. I know they weren't." It was a quiet confession to an empty road, one that would matter far more years later. And that night, for the first time, the idea began to form. This was no accident. Someone wanted it buried. By the fourth day, the community's determination began to wither beneath the weight of unanswered questions. The storm had ended, the sun returned, but the land still felt bruised, like it held something it refused to release. Volunteers searched until their legs ached and their voices cracked, but they found no truck, no clothing, no footprints, no sign that Clark and Evan had ever crossed the bend at all. Only the memory of those erased tire marks remained in their minds, quietly unsettling, like a puzzle piece someone had deliberately removed. Margaret, drained from nights without sleep, sat at her kitchen table staring at the paper star Evan had made. Its folded edges were slightly smudged from his small hands. She brushed her thumb across it again and again, trying to imagine him safe, imagining a scenario-any scenario, where this nightmare wasn't real. But each hour that passed deepened the hollow inside her chest. She moved through the house like a shadow, afraid to stop, afraid to sit still in the silence. Neighbors delivered meals she never touched. They whispered prayers she barely heard. It was as if time itself refused to move forward. Across town, inside the sheriff's office, Mercer prepared his formal report with an unsettling calm. His pen scratched across the paper with mechanical precision. Cause of loss, storm. Related. Probable location of vehicle. Riverbed. Status. Presumed drowned. To anyone reading it, the words might have seemed reasonable. But to those who had watched him ignore evidence, silence witnesses, and bury the only physical clues, the report felt like a lock snapping shut. Deputy Harris stood near the door, fists clenched. He watched the sheriff stamp the file with a heavy thud. "Sir," Harris said quietly, "we haven't searched the West Ravine fully, and the Chapel Road." Mercer didn't look up. "The case is closed, Harris." "It doesn't feel right," Harris pressed. "We didn't explore the area behind the chapel, and that cloth I found." Mercer's eyes finally lifted, cold and unwavering. "Are you questioning my authority?" Harris swallowed hard. "No, Sheriff, just concerned." "Don't be," Mercer replied. "Families imagine things when grief sets in. We're not feeding their delusions." He placed the file inside a drawer, then locked it with a small brass key. Harris knew at that moment the truth had slipped beyond their reach, trapped inside a system meant to protect it. When Mercer left the room, Harris approached the drawer and rested his hand on the wood. Behind that thin barrier sat the last official record of Clark and Evan Hensley, a record crafted by a man who didn't want them found. Across town, the church held a prayer gathering for the family. The pews were filled with silent faces, people sitting shoulder to shoulder as the pastor spoke softly about faith, storms, and unexplainable tragedies. But even he hesitated when mentioning the sheriff. The room felt tense, as if everyone sensed something was wrong, but feared saying it aloud. Margaret stood beside the front pew, eyes unfocused. When she spoke to the congregation, her voice trembled. "Clark was a good man," she whispered. "Evan loved everyone. If they're out there, if they're hurt, someone knows something, please, don't stop looking. Those words lingered in the air long after the gathering ended. That night she returned home alone. The wind rattled the windows softly. She placed Evan's paper star on the bedside table, just as she did every night since he vanished. She pressed her forehead against Clark's jacket hanging by the door, breathing in the faint scent that still clung to it. Dust, pine, and the traces of a man who never came home. In the days that followed, the search thinned. People returned to their farms, their routines, their obligations. Life moved on in the way small towns often do, slow, steady, reluctant but inevitable, and yet a quiet discomfort settled over the community, the unspoken feeling that something fundamental had been mishandled, something buried, something intentionally left untouched. Deputy Harris considered reopening the search himself, but Mercer's warning echoed in his mind. In a town where power moved quietly through backrooms and church dinners, challenging the sheriff could cost a man his job, or more. Weeks later, the Hensley truck was never found, no bodies surfaced downstream, no personal items washed ashore. Clark and Evan had vanished completely, as if the storm had swallowed them whole. Finally, Mercer delivered the final blow, the official closure of the case. Just like that, the Hensley disappearance became another cold file gathering dust in a locked drawer. Filed away, forgotten by authority, remembered only by grief. But time has a way of loosening locked doors. Because 25 years later, in a courthouse basement no one visited, that same file would be rediscovered, and the truth hiding inside it would begin to breathe again. 25 years later, the Hensley case existed only as a faint murmur in the collective memory of Crooked Hill. A generation had passed, new houses had risen, old farms were sold, and the chapel where the tracks once led stood, abandoned beneath creeping vines. Sheriff Mercer had died a respected man in the eyes of many, honored at his funeral, praised for decades of loyal service. No one mentioned the case he quietly sealed away in a locked drawer. Time had dusted over the truth, but it had not erased it. In 1967, Lyle Porter, a young urban historian with a habit of resurrecting forgotten stories, arrived in the county to research rural law enforcement practices during wartime. He was tall, soft-spoken, and observant, the kind of man who noticed small inconsistencies the way others noticed weather changes. Lyle had grown up listening to accounts of unresolved cases, but it was the Hensley disappearance, mentioned offhand by a retired librarian, that hooked itself into his mind like a thorn. She spoke of it while guiding him through courthouse archives. "Terrible tragedy," she said. "Storm took a father and son, or so they said." Her voice carried a heaviness, something unsaid. Lyle paused, "or so they said." She hesitated. "Ask around and you'll hear things, but the sheriff back then, people didn't question him." That single line lodged itself in Lyle's curiosity. He began requesting old case records, newspaper clippings, and field reports. The Hensley file was not among the typical archives, so he asked the clerk. "There's no such file," the clerk replied, adjusting his glasses. Storm-related deaths were barely documented, but Lyle wasn't convinced. The librarian's tone returned to him, uneasy, as if brushing a ghost. The next day, he returned to the courthouse alone. With permission to access the basement storage room, he descended the narrow steps into a dimly lit chamber, cluttered with decades of forgotten paperwork. Dust hung in the air, thick and shimmering in the flashlight beam. Rows of metal shelves creaked softly as he moved between them. On the far wall, he noticed an old wooden cabinet with mismatched drawers, the kind used before the county standardized its filing systems. Most drawers were labeled by year or case type, but one drawer, painted over and chipped around the edges, bore no label at all. Lyle tugged on it, stuck. He braced himself and pulled harder. It slid open with a dry groan. Inside lay a small stack of files, brittle with age. The second file in the pile caught his attention immediately. Hensley, Clark and Evan, 1942. The lettering was faint, as if someone had once tried to erase it. The file felt heavier than its size should allow. Lyle opened it slowly. Inside were a few weather-worn documents, Mercer's official incident summary, 2 short statements from volunteers, and a single faded photograph of the Hensleys taken the week before they vanished. The simplicity of the file troubled him. Missing persons cases, especially involving a child, rarely contain so little. He reached the final page and felt his pulse quicken. A blotched, partially redacted report mentioned an early clue: tire marks located near chapel grounds, markings inconsistent with Hensley vehicle. Investigation halted due to weather conditions. The writing cut off abruptly. Lyle frowned. Weather conditions. The marks had been inside an area shielded by trees. And why was the chapel mentioned? It appeared nowhere else in the file. He leaned back, studying the papers laid out before him. Something was missing, something obvious. An entire dimension of the investigation had been trimmed away, leaving only a skeleton of what truly happened. Footsteps echoed faintly from above. Lyle froze, listening. They faded. He returned to the file, more determined than before. He gently shook the folder, and a small envelope slipped out, wedged deep between the pages. It contained a rusted truck key, a child's broken compass, and a scrap of paper with Mercer's initials on it. None of these items appeared in the documented evidence list. A slow chill ran through him. Why would a sheriff hide physical evidence in an unmarked drawer? Why were the chapel grounds referenced only once, then never again? And the compass. Lyle held it gently, turning it in the dim light. One hinge was broken clean through, as if pulled apart by small, frightened hands. He whispered to himself, this wasn't an accident. Someone knew more. The basement suddenly felt colder. Lyle tucked the evidence back into the envelope, slid it into his coat pocket, and closed the drawer. As he climbed the steps back into the courthouse hallway, one thought followed him like a shadow. If this file survived by accident, what else had Mercer tried to bury? And that question would lead him next to the place mentioned only once, the chapel on Crooked Hill. The box was never supposed to be there. Laura felt that truth the moment she slid it out from behind the collapsing row of case files. Files that should have held everything about the Hayes disappearance, but instead contained decades of dust, mislabels, and deliberate gaps. The wooden container was wedged so far back it must have been placed there before the newer shelves were installed. Someone had hidden it long before she ever considered reopening the case. She carried it to the archive table, hands trembling. The lid was coated with a film of gray dust that broke apart under her fingertips. Her mind replayed all she had unearthed in the previous day: the altered logs, the missing reports, Dalton's handwriting tucked where it shouldn't have been. Those discoveries hinted at corruption, but this box, this felt like the heart of it. The moment she cracked the lid, a stale, earthy scent drifted up, as if the box had sealed in time itself. Inside, lying neatly folded, was a canvas jacket. Faded, frayed at the shoulders, the kind a working man would wear. Laura lifted it gently. The initials stitched inside the collar are H made her breath catch, Robert Hayes, the missing father, but according to the official inventory, all his personal items had been returned to his family in 1943. So why was his jacket still here, hidden in a place no one ever checked? Beneath the jacket lay a bundle of photographs bound with twine. The string snapped easily, brittle with age. Laura spread the photos across the table. The first image was of the same empty highway where Robert's truck had been found, but a sheriff's patrol car appeared parked in the distance, door open, lights off. The timestamp placed the photo several hours before the disappearance was reported. Her pulse quickened. Why had deputies been there so early? And why had this photo never appeared in the case file? The next photo shook her even more. A blurry shape, a small figure, was being led toward the same patrol car. A child, The outline was unmistakable, even blurred by motion or perhaps intention. If this was Samuel Hayes, it meant the sheriff's office had contact with him after the supposed vanish without a trace. The question wasn't just what happened that night, but why it had been erased. Under the photos sat a weather-worn logbook. Several entries had been scratched out with such force the paper was torn. Her eyes stopped on one line, contact made with S.H., transfer location the chapel. The initials matched Samuel Hayes. So did the date. Laura exhaled shakily, flipping the next page. A folded map slipped free, marked with a dark pencil route leading to the old abandoned chapel. She leaned closer. A small red X sat near the rear of the building. But the town blueprints didn't show anything unusual there. She traced the line again, feeling a prickling at the back of her neck. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope labeled in stiff typewriter ink. Confidential, do not release. It trembled in her fingers as she opened it. Inside were 2 witness statements from rancher Miles Carter. The first described a late-night argument, Robert Hayes shouting at 2 deputies on the roadside, Samuel crying inside the truck. The second statement, signed the same date, claimed Carter saw nothing. The signatures didn't match. One had been forged. Laura closed her eyes. Someone had rewritten reality. She kept digging. A memo surfaced, short, cold, authoritative. Sheriff Dalton had ordered all Hayes case materials moved off. Record inaccessible and indefinitely withheld. The memo was dated 3 days after the disappearance. That alone shattered every official statement the town had accepted as truth. The archive lights flickered overhead, casting fractured shadows. Laura felt a sudden, crushing awareness. These weren't abandoned files. They were deliberately buried secrets, maintained across generations. Someone, even after Dalton, had made sure this box never surfaced. As she repacked the documents, something metallic clinked faintly at the bottom. She reached in and pulled out a small rusted key attached to a broken leather strap. A tag hung loosely, almost too faded to read, but under the dust 3 words emerged: chapel, lower door. Her heart stopped. There was no lower door on any plan she'd reviewed. No record, no mention, which meant it wasn't meant to be found. Laura held the key tightly. Whatever the town had forgotten, whatever the sheriff had buried, waited there. And now she was holding the only key that could unlock it. Crooked Hill looked different at night, less like a slope of dry Texas earth and more like a brooding silhouette rising against the horizon. Laura stood at the base of it, clutching the rusted key she'd found in the forbidden box. The tag's faint words, chapel, lower door, echoed in her head as if spoken by someone standing beside her. She took a breath, letting the cool air settle her nerves. The discovery of the hidden box had shattered every certainty she had about the Hayes disappearance. Now the path forward led straight to the chapel. The sheriff's office had erased from its own history. The abandoned structure came into view as she climbed. The chapel had been empty since the late 1950s, at least according to public records, but rumor always kept it barely alive. Strange noises, lights at odd hours, stories older residents dismissed with a tired shrug. Up close, the building looked worse. The wood siding curled outward like peeling bark. A boarded window rattled softly in the wind. The place felt untouched, yet watched. Laura's flashlight beam swept across the front doors. Both chained shut. She circled around the chapel, boots sinking into dry weeds. Halfway around, the ground dipped sharply. There, almost hidden beneath years of growth and debris, was a narrow stone archway. A door had once stood there. Now only the frame remained. Her breath tightened, the lower door. She crouched, brushing away the dirt and roots. A small, rusted keyhole glinted faintly. The key from the archive felt cold in her hand as she slid it forward. It didn't fit perfectly. Years of corrosion fought back. But after a moment of pressure, it turned with a reluctant click. The mechanism groaned like it hadn't moved in decades. The door opened inward. A wave of musty air rushed out, thick with the scent of old earth and trapped time. She lifted her flashlight. A narrow stone staircase descended into darkness, swallowing the beam almost instantly. With a steadying breath, she stepped inside. The steps creaked beneath her boots, even though they were stone. Maybe it was her imagination, or maybe the chapel itself remembered things she did not. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage widened into a small underground corridor. Dust particles drifted through the beam of her flashlight like slow-moving snow. The walls were marked with faint scuffs, as though something had been dragged. She followed the corridor until it opened into a room barely large enough to stand in. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, old boxes, broken lanterns, scraps of fabric, nothing that looked recent. But the center of the room held something unmistakably out of place, a metal chair bolted to the floor. Laura paused, pulse hammering. The chair wasn't old enough to be from the 1940s, but it wasn't new either. The straps attached to its arms and legs made something cold ripple through her. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't sanctified. This wasn't a chapel basement. This was a holding room. She scanned the surrounding walls again. On the far side, tucked under a fallen board, she spotted a small wooden crate. Kneeling, she pushed aside debris and pulled it free. The lid wasn't nailed shut. It lifted with a soft sigh of dust. Inside were papers, dozens of them, reports, notes, statements, all stamped property of the Hayes investigation, 1942. Her throat tightened. These were the files she had been searching for, the ones the sheriff's office claimed had been misplaced, merged, or lost during renovations. And here they were, hidden beneath a chapel that wasn't supposed to have a lower door. She flipped through the first few documents, a timeline detailing arrests the night before the disappearance, a witness list far longer than the official file, a statement from Robert Hayes claiming he and Samuel were being followed by deputies, filed only hours before both vanished. But one page slid loose from the stack. It was a photograph, a grainy, low-angle shot of two men standing in the chapel's main hall. One of them was unmistakable, Sheriff Dalton. The second man had his back turned, but Laura recognized the outline, the posture, the sheriff's badge clipped to the belt. He was still alive, and he had inherited Dalton's silence. A chill swept through her. Finding the box had been shocking, but this, the underground room, the files, the evidence of a second sheriff involved, was something larger, something active. She stood slowly, gripping the crate. Someone knew she would come here. And she had the sinking feeling she wasn't alone on Crooked Hill anymore. The cold night air clung to Laura as she carried the crate of hidden files up the stairs of the chapel's lower chamber. Her hands shook, not from the weight but from the implications. Sheriff Dalton's cover-up had always been a suspicion. Now it was fact. And worse, someone after him had continued it. Someone who still walked the streets of the town she thought she knew. Back in her car, she locked the doors and placed the crate on the passenger seat. Her flashlight beam flickered out, leaving the small interior in dim silence broken only by her unsteady breaths. The photograph she'd found, the one showing Dalton and a second sheriff in the chapel, lay on top of the files. She kept glancing at it, studying the back of the man standing beside Dalton. The stance, the build, the clipped badge, she knew that silhouette. She had seen it in the current sheriff's framed portrait only 2 days ago. Sheriff Mark Atkins, the realization settled like a stone in her stomach. If Atkins had inherited the silence, then her investigation wasn't just dangerous, it was being watched. The drive back into town felt longer than usual. Every set of headlights behind her made her pulse spike. She knew she couldn't take the crate to the sheriff's office. She couldn't trust the department at all. Instead, she parked behind the closed library, where no one would question a late night arrival. She carried the crate inside, moving toward the private research room she used whenever she needed quiet. The overhead light buzzed softly as she set the crate on the table and opened the first folder. The very first page had thick black redaction bars covering entire paragraphs. She traced one with her finger, feeling a surge of frustration. These weren't accidental omissions. Someone had aggressively edited the files. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized the redactions weren't consistent. Some pages were untouched, others had selective lines struck out, and one sheet had been redacted so carelessly the original ink bled faintly beneath the blackout, as if rushed. She angled the page under the overhead lamp. Slowly, the faint imprint revealed itself. Child transferred at 2:14 M to lower holding, sheriff present. Her stomach tightened, lower holding. That aligned with the underground chamber she had just discovered. But what was transferred there? And why had the deputy who wrote this account been removed from the force only 1 week later? She turned the page. Another redaction. Another faint imprint beneath the ink. Father resisted. Injuries sustained. Orders given by D. The name cut off just before the redaction. But the letter was enough. Dalton had ordered something to happen that night. Something violent. Something no one had ever spoken of. She flipped through pages, statements from townspeople who had reported hearing shouting on the highway. Redacted. A ledger of patrol car movements, due entries erased entirely. A testimony from a young deputy saying a child was scared and asking for his father, blacked out. The truth was here, suffocated under ink. But then she found something that made her sit upright, a memo unsigned with no date. Only 3 sentences: remove files from main archive, secure under Crooked Hill, Sheriff A will assume responsibility, do not disclose further. Sheriff A, Atkins. Laura felt cold all over. Just as she reached for another document, her phone buzzed violently on the table. The sound was too loud in the quiet room. She grabbed it. Unknown number, 1 message. Stop digging. Her breath froze. A second message followed seconds later. You're opening doors that were closed for a reason. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The timing was too precise. Whoever sent the messages knew exactly where she was, or what she was doing. She turned off the phone immediately, heart racing as she scanned the empty library hallway. No footsteps. No shadows, but the silence felt different now. Heavy, alert, as if someone had been here moments before. Laura forced herself back to the documents. Fear couldn't stop her. Not now. At the bottom of the crate, beneath the files, she found a thin booklet she hadn't seen earlier. The cover read Incident Report Annex, a designation she had never heard used in the Hayes case. Inside were half a dozen pages, each stamped TOP priority. And unlike the others, these pages weren't redacted. They detailed a trance for order for Subject S, H, to be moved to secondary holding, Crooked Hill Chapel, under the supervision of 2 officers, the date, the night Robert and Samuel vanished. The last page stopped her cold. A signature scrawled hastily at the bottom, Sheriff M. Atkins. She stared at it until her vision blurred. The truth wasn't just buried. It had been guarded, and the man guarding it was still in power. Laura stood, gripping the booklet so tightly it bent. Tomorrow, she would confront the only living person who knew what happened in 1942. But tonight, someone out there knew she had just uncovered the first unredacted truth. The night settled over Crooked Hill like a blanket too heavy to lift. Laura sat in her study, the crate of Hayes files open on the table before her, the unredacted booklet from the chapel lying next to her laptop. Every page she had uncovered whispered fragments of the past, each document a voice long silenced. She realized with a chilling clarity that the Hensley disappearance, and everything surrounding it, was not just a cold case. It was a story being actively buried, controlled by those who had inherited Dalton's secrets. And now, Laura felt as if the past itself were speaking directly to her. Her eyes fell on a stack of handwritten notes she had overlooked earlier. They were brief, almost frantic. A clerk's account of observing a small figure being guided through the chapel corridor, a volunteer noting tire marks near the lower entrance, a neighbor recalling late night lights moving through the structure. None of these had survived in the official reports. Someone had redacted them, replaced them, or dismissed them entirely, But the handwriting, jagged, rushed, was human, vulnerable, and unmistakably authentic. Laura read the first note aloud, the words trembling on her lips. I saw him, a child. He was scared. The man with the badge. He told me to leave. Her throat tightened. She imagined that child, frightened and small, led into the darkness beneath the chapel. Every description she read felt like a heartbeat trapped in time, a pulse the town had ignored for decades. She pictured Robert Hayes pleading, Samuel clinging to his father's coat. The visual was unbearable, yet she could not look away. She needed these voices to be heard. Her laptop pinged softly, breaking her concentration. A new email had arrived from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "They never left." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she opened it. Inside were scanned copies of additional statements, apparently lost to the original files. A local grocer's recollection of Samuel asking for his father in a trembling voice. A retired deputy's note that hinted at a secret meeting in the chapel's lower room on the night of the disappearance. And a final, chilling sentence scrawled on the margin of one document. The sheriff ensured no one would find them alive. The handwriting was different from the rest, older, more deliberate, but its meaning was unmistakable. Laura leaned back, her mind racing. If these notes were accurate, then the cover-up had been meticulous. Every voice, every fragment of truth, had been systematically silenced. And yet, she now held them all, the fragmented testimonies, the redacted reports, the unsealed photos, an entire network of suppressed voices that, collectively, demanded attention. The room seemed to close around her as she absorbed the weight of decades of secrecy. Dust motes floated in the overhead light like tiny echoes of the past. She could almost hear them, whispering through time, the frantic breathing of a child, the pleading of a father, the quiet footsteps of deputies enforcing silence. Every page, every document was a fragment of that chorus, and in that moment Laura realized she was the only one who could piece it together, give it form, and finally tell what had been hidden for 75 years. Her hand shook as she reached for the photograph she had found in the chapel crate, the one showing Sheriff Dalton and the other officer. She held it close, imagining the faces of those two men and the terrible authority they wielded. The eyes of the child in the photo, blurred though they were, seemed to plead for recognition, for someone to understand what had been done to him. For a fleeting moment, Laura felt the weight of every soul silenced by that cover-up. She opened a fresh notebook, determined to record everything. Line by line, she began transcribing the notes, adding context from the files, connecting dates and locations. As she wrote, a pattern emerged, a grim chronology that mapped not only the disappearance but the careful orchestration of its concealment. Each voice, once muffled, now formed a collective narrative, and Laura felt the urgency to preserve it. This was more than investigation. It was a reckoning. Hours passed unnoticed. The wind whispered against the window panes, echoing the cries from long ago. Laura paused and closed her eyes, imagining the voices still alive in that hidden chapel. She could almost hear them in the silence, a father's hope, a son's fear, and the faint tremor of injustice crying out across time. A sudden thought froze her mid-breath. These voices were not just echoes. They were warnings. Whoever had maintained Dalton's silence might still be watching, and the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous her journey would become. She stared at the notebook, then at the crate of files. The next step was clear, to follow the trail directly into the hands of those who had hidden the truth for decades. But before that, she needed to honor the voices she had already uncovered, to let them speak, to ensure the past was not forgotten, and somewhere in the shadows of Crooked Hill she felt the faint stirring of the people who had vanished, alive in memory, alive in ink, and waiting for justice to finally answer. The first rays of dawn stretched across Crooked Hill, painting the chapel roof in a wash of gold and shadow. Laura arrived before anyone else could notice, carrying her notebook and the crate of recovered Hayes files. The air smelled faintly of rain from the night before, damp and sharp. Every step toward the chapel felt like a walk through history, each echo beneath her boots carrying the weight of decades, long silence. She had followed the voices, transcribed the hidden notes, and now the only remaining obstacle was confronting the man whose shadow had lingered over the Hayes case longer than anyone realized, Sheriff Mercer. Though Mercer had retired years ago, his presence still permeated the town. Stories of his meticulous approach, his unwavering authority, and the quiet fear he inspired in subordinates had persisted like an invisible fog. The locals spoke of him rarely, mostly in whispers, as if mentioning his name aloud might stir old secrets. Laura knew that confronting Mercer, if he was still alive, meant approaching the epicenter of that silence. And yet she felt compelled to see it through. The hidden files, the lower chapel, the voices from the past. They demanded it. The chapel doors were unlocked now. Laura had picked the lock the night before and left them untouched. She entered, flashlight in hand, and descended to the lower chamber where she had found the crate. The room smelled of aged stone and earth, the same musty scent she remembered from her first exploration. Dust hung in the beam of her flashlight like suspended memories. As she arranged the files on the floor, a faint creak echoed from above. She froze. Someone was here. Her mind raced through possibilities. Another investigator, a curious historian, perhaps even a local with old ties to the sheriff. Then a low voice called down the staircase, "Laura." She stiffened. The voice was calm, measured, yet carried decades of authority. It was him, Mercer, or at least the man who had been sheriff when everything began. He descended slowly, hands visible, showing no sign of aggression. The weight in his eyes, however, was unmistakable. A life spent in secrecy had left its mark. "You shouldn't be here," he said, stopping a few feet from the staircase. "Some things are better left buried. I can't leave it buried," Laura replied evenly. "Not after everything I've found, the Hayes case, the files, the chapel. They're all here, you know why." Mercer's gaze fell to the crate. He exhaled, a long, measured sound, as if he were preparing to carry a burden he had carried alone for decades. "I thought I protected them. I thought I was doing the right thing. For the boy, for the father, for the town." His voice trembled just slightly, betraying the stoicism he had worn for years. "I kept the truth from everyone because I believed the consequences would be worse than the silence." Laura knelt beside the crate, careful not to make sudden movements. "What happened that night?" she asked softly, not accusatory, but seeking the clarity only he could provide. Mercer looked away toward the far wall. "The patrols, the transfer. I thought I could control it. I didn't anticipate that fear would spiral, that what began as a protective measure became a cage of lies. Every report I altered, every file I hid, I told myself it was to protect Samuel and Robert, but in the end I was protecting no one but myself." His voice broke. "And the town. They deserved to know the truth." Laura studied him, seeing the decades of guilt etched into the lines of his face, the stooped shoulders of a man haunted by decisions that outlived him. She realized the weight of silence, the human cost of secrecy, and the terrible duality of Mercer's role, both protector and perpetrator of concealment. "You need to tell someone," she said gently, her voice steady. "These voices, these files, they can't be ignored any longer. People have waited too long for answers." Mercer nodded slowly. "I suppose. It's time the truth came to light, but there are others involved. You'll have to be careful." He paused, then added, almost whispering, "Mercer's shadow. It stretches further than you imagine." Laura closed the notebook, her fingers brushing the edge of the crate. Every revelation, every note, every photograph had led her to this moment. Mercer's confession, even partial, offered not only validation but a pathway forward. She understood now that the investigation wasn't just about uncovering facts. It was about untangling the human consequences of decades-long secrecy, about giving voice to those who had been silenced. As she stood, Mercer lingered at the bottom of the stairs, a silhouette against the dim light of the upper chamber. Laura felt the weight of history, the collective pain of lost years, and the responsibility to move forward. The next step was clear, confronting the present guardians of the secrets, the men still in power who had perpetuated Dalton's cover-up. Mercer had spoken, but the shadows remained. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "The past is speaking, and I'm going to listen." The crates, the files, the whispers, they were no longer just remnants. They were her guide into the heart of the truth, and the investigation had only just begun. The moon hung low over Crooked Hill, casting a silver light across the abandoned chapel. Laura parked her car on the gravel path and stepped out, the crate of Hayes files secured beside her. Her heart pounded, every instinct warning that tonight was different. Mercer's partial confession had revealed the scale of the cover-up, but he had also warned her. The shadows of the past weren't confined to old files. They had guardians, men who still walked the town streets, men who knew what had been hidden in the crypt below the chapel, men who would do anything to ensure it stayed secret. The chapel doors groaned as she pushed them open. Inside, dust motes floated through the flashlight beam, disturbed by her movement. The lower door had been sealed by weathered boards, but with a rusted key from the archive, she unlocked it easily. The mechanism protested with a metallic screech that echoed down the stone staircase. Her breath caught. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, as if the walls themselves were listening. Laura descended, careful with each step. The air was thick with must, stale earth, and the faint metallic tang of old iron. At the bottom, the corridor stretched into darkness, wider than she remembered. Shadows pooled along the walls, dancing in the beam of her flashlight. Every creak of the stairs above or whistle of wind outside the chapel felt magnified, an invisible presence hovering at the edges of perception. At the end of the corridor, the small room from her last visit loomed ahead. It looked unchanged, shelves lined with boxes, the stone floor scattered with debris. But tonight, she was not just here to observe. She was here to uncover. She knelt beside the crate and began laying out the files, organizing the photographs, maps, and statements. Each document told a piece of the story, yet gaps remained. Pieces were missing, deliberately removed. She realized with a sinking feeling. She needed the crypt itself for answers, the hidden spaces that had long concealed the truth. Her flashlight caught on a stone slab at the far end of the room, slightly ajar. It hadn't been there the last time. Laura approached, kneeling to examine it. Faint scratches around the edges suggested it could be lifted. Heart hammering, she pried the slab upward, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. The air inside smelled foul, rich with decay and years of confinement. Her mind recoiled, but she forced herself to peer inside. The first object she saw was a small, worn chute, child-sized, leather cracked and darkened by age. Her stomach tightened. Next, she found fragments of clothing, carefully folded yet untouched for decades. And then her flashlight illuminated a small bundle of bones, partially wrapped in a tattered cloth. Laura swallowed hard, fighting nausea. The evidence of what had occurred here was undeniable and long hidden. A sense of horror and sorrow pressed down on her. Yet the crypt held more than physical evidence. She noticed scratches on the walls, small marks that looked almost like letters or numbers. Leaning closer, she realized they were a tally, counting days, months, or perhaps years. Someone had survived here, or had tried to keep a record of those who had. The implication was staggering. There was more than one layer of concealment, more than one person who had suffered or attempted to survive in silence. Laura carefully documented everything, snapping photographs and noting each detail in her notebook. Every item she uncovered deepened the weight of decades-long deception. The silence of the crypt, once protective, now felt oppressive, almost accusatory. She could imagine Robert and Samuel, or others, trapped in the web of secrecy, unheard and unseen. The truth had been stored here, hidden beneath layers of stone and dust, waiting for someone brave or stubborn enough to find it. A sudden sound, a low scraping from the upper corridor, made her freeze. Someone was above. Her flashlight flicked toward the stairs, but the shadows were too deep. Whoever it was, they knew she had found the crypt. Her heart raced, and a cold calculation entered her mind. She could either confront whoever was above or leave evidence for the authorities to handle. But she knew there was no turning back. Laura took a deep breath and stood, the crate in front of her. Every discovery had brought her here, every voice from the past, every redacted report, every secret suppressed by Dalton and Mercer. Now the crypt had spoken in the only language the town had been forced to ignore. Evidence, tangible and undeniable. She could almost hear the whispers of the vanished echoing through the stone corridors, guiding her next steps. Tonight, she realized, was not just about uncovering the past. It was about facing those still hiding in its shadow. And whatever awaited her above, she was ready to meet it. The night air outside the chapel was thick and silent, pressing against Laura like a warning. Her hands were still trembling from the crypt's revelations. The evidence she had uncovered, the shoes, the tattered clothing, the bones, the scratched tally marks, had all pointed to one unshakable truth. Someone alive had maintained Dalton's cover-up for decades, and they had been watching. Every shadow now felt like it could conceal an observer, and Laura knew instinctively that she would soon face the man who embodied the final barrier between the town and the truth, Sheriff Mark Atkins. She ascended the stone staircase from the lower crypt slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Each step echoed loudly, as if the chapel itself were calling out. At the top, the main hall was empty, dusty rays of moonlight spilling through broken windows. She set the crate down gently, arranging the documents in order of urgency. This was her preparation, a silent ritual before confrontation. Her heartbeat thudded like a drum, warning her that the past was no longer distant. It was about to collide with the present. A floorboard creaked above her, deliberate, controlled. Laura stiffened. Someone was coming down the corridor. She turned sharply, shining the flashlight toward the sound. For a moment, there was only darkness and the whisper of the wind. Then, emerging from the shadows, a tall figure appeared, Sheriff Atkins, still in his uniform, though frayed and faded by time. His face was pale, eyes hard, yet weary. The weight of years of secrets seemed to press down upon him like a cloak. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, voice low, carefully measured. "You've stirred things that were buried for a reason." "I had to know the truth," Laura replied steadily, her notebook clutched in one hand. "All of it, Dalton, Mercer, the crypt, the files. It's all here. You can't lie about it anymore." Atkins' gaze shifted to the crate, then to the scattered documents. For the first time, a flicker of doubt passed across his face. "You think you understand what I've done. You think seeing the evidence changes the consequences. There are reasons some things were hidden. Some truths are too heavy to carry." Laura shook her head. "The people waiting for justice deserve more than secrets. The Hayes family, the child, everyone lost. They deserve the truth. You've protected your legacy, but at what cost? Silence hasn't healed anyone." Atkins' shoulders sagged. He took a slow step forward, boots creaking against the stone. "You don't understand. The night they vanish. Samuel, Robert, I did what I thought was right. Dalton left me with instructions. Protect the boy. Keep him safe. Keep him alive." His voice broke, and Laura noticed the tension in his knuckles as he clenched them. But protection isn't without sacrifice, and sacrifices. They pile up over years. Laura's voice softened, urgent. "But they were never meant to be hidden like this. Someone is dead, someone is suffering, and the town is being lied to. You can't keep controlling the story. The truth will come out, one way or another." Atkins looked away, the moonlight catching the faint lines of tears he had not allowed himself to shed. "And now you've seen the crypt, the remnants of my choices. The evidence doesn't just accuse me. It condemns me, but it also explains why I lied. I lied to protect, not to harm, and that, in its twisted way, was the final lie I told to the town." Laura moved closer, feeling the weight of years pressing between them. It's not too late to fix it. Admit it publicly, release the files, tell the town what happened. They deserve closure even if it's painful. Atkins studied her, a lifetime of fear and guilt waging war in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "You're right, the truth has waited too long. I've carried it alone for too many years. It's time." Laura exhaled, relief mingling with lingering dread. The final lie, the lie that had sustained the cover-up for 75 years, was about to be dismantled. But the path forward was still fraught. Those who had hidden behind Dalton and Mercer's legacy might resist, even violently. Yet she now had Atkins' cooperation, and that meant the story, finally, could be told. She glanced at the scattered documents, at the crate containing decades of suppressed evidence, at the shadows that had held the past captive. The investigation was far from over, but tonight, in the quiet chapel, one of the last walls of secrecy had begun to crumble. The truth, at long last, was breathing. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracked windows of the chapel, casting long, fractured shadows across the dusty stone floor. Laura stood in the lower chamber, the crate of haze files beside her, and listened. The crypt beneath Crooked Hill had whispered its secrets, and for the first time she felt the weight of their full story. The vanished father, the lost son, the decades of silence, and the lives that had been quietly erased from public memory. The echoes beneath the chapel were no longer just evidence. They were voices demanding justice, voices that refused to remain buried. She carefully catalogued the final items: a torn ledger, fragments of clothing, and the small bones that had remained hidden for 75 years. Each piece told a fragment of the story, yet together they formed a narrative that no one could ignore. Laura ran her fingers over the documents, feeling the impressions of hurried handwriting, the ink smudged in places where fear or urgency had dictated the pace. These weren't just files. They were lifelines reaching across generations, insisting that someone remember. Outside, the wind stirred through the chapel's empty windows, rattling boards and loose shingles. Laura imagined Robert Hayes pacing the hallway, Samuel clinging to his father's coat, and the unseen deputies moving silently in the shadows. She could almost hear the whisper of their voices, carried faintly on the currents of air, a plea, a warning, a memory demanding to be heard. The crypt was more than a hiding place. It was a repository of grief, hope, and unfinished stories. And now, she was the one charged with translating those echoes into truth. Her mind replayed the confrontations of the previous nights, the confessions of Mercer, the final admission from Sheriff Atkins, the redacted notes that had almost gone unnoticed. The human cost of silence had been staggering, yet it was also illuminating. She realized the town itself had been a character in this story, complicit in its own ignorance, relying on authority figures to suppress pain in the guise of protection. And yet, through the whispers, the photographs, and the hidden files, the lives of Robert and Samuel Hayes persisted. They had not been forgotten, they had been silenced. Laura carefully lifted the final photograph from the crate, the one showing Dalton and Mercer in the chapel years before. She had stared at it countless times, tracing the shadows and angles, imagining the lives intertwined with the officers' choices. Now, in the quiet light of morning, the image felt almost like a testament, a proof of what had happened and a warning of what could still happen if the truth were ignored. Every secret they had tried to keep buried had left a mark, and every mark now demanded recognition. She rose, gathering the files with methodical precision. The crate would not return to anonymity. It would travel, piece by piece, into the hands of historians, investigators, and journalists who could carry the story beyond the chapel's walls. The town would see what had been concealed, the careful orchestration of silence, the human lives caught in its machinery, and the ultimate resilience of memory itself. Laura felt a quiet determination settle over her. The story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the Hayes family, to the town, and to history. Stepping toward the lower staircase, she paused. The shadows seemed to linger longer than the light, as if reluctant to release their hold. She imagined the crypt, once a place of confinement and fear, now transformed into a space of reckoning. Each echo of footsteps, each whisper of paper, each trace of a vanished life, carried with it the weight of accountability. The chapel had kept its secrets, but it could not keep them forever. And Laura knew she was the final listener, the one capable of ensuring that the echoes became a voice. As she ascended into the main hall, the first sounds of the waking town filtered through the cracked doors: a distant rooster, the shuffle of early laborers, the faint rumble of a passing truck. The world outside had not changed, yet everything had shifted. The past had been confronted, the lies exposed, and the silence fractured. What remained now was the aftermath, the reckoning, the grieving, the healing, and the testimony of those who had been lost. Laura stepped outside, the morning sun catching the chapel's worn facade. She took a deep breath, feeling the wind on her face and the weight of history in her chest. Beneath Crooked Hill, the crypt had spoken, and the echoes would no longer be ignored. The final chapter was not only the unveiling of truth, but the promise that memory, no matter how long suppressed, could endure. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the chapel and the hearts of those who had listened, Robert and Samuel Hayes' voices finally found their place, unforgotten, honored, and heard.